생각이야, 병신아. 개쇼하지 말고 일어나.
They target people in need of money or those who are in debt, and then they are lured. They are then abducted and taken to an unknown location. Their names are erased and they are given numbers for identification. They are placed in challenges within groups against each other. The loser is eliminated from the game and loses their life. The winner takes the money of the person who was with them. It brings out the worst in human nature. So what is happening? Where did all these actions and deeds come from? Stay with us to learn the full story, and don't forget to subscribe to get the latest videos. In the late 1980s, there was a detention camp in South Korea called Brothers Home, a place not often mentioned but deeply connected to the horrific reality depicted in the Korean series Squid Game. This camp was a meeting point between the dark realities that were occurring in South Korea at the time and the events portrayed in the series. But what happened in this place? How did these truths influence the development of the story in Squid Game? And are there any similarities between the real-life story and what was presented in the artistic work? In the late 1970s, Brothers Home was established in the city of Busan, South Korea, and it was supposed to be a center for the care of the homeless and marginalized individuals. But instead of being a place that offered assistance, it turned into a detention center where thousands of people were abducted and held against their will. The same concept of forced detention appears in the series Squid Game, where individuals facing financial struggles are gathered and forced to participate in brutal games that put their lives at risk. In both cases, individuals are forced to participate in harsh conditions filled with risks and dangers. In Brothers Home, the prisoners were forced to work in construction projects and farms, making them labor under poor health conditions in a harsh and brutal environment. The prisoners were also subjected to beating and violence, which is the same cruel treatment we witnessed in Squid Game. In Squid Game, the contestants are forced to take part in terrifying challenges just to win a financial prize, reflecting the extent of the violations that occur when human life becomes nothing more than a game in the hands of others. In both cases, we see the exploitation of the vulnerable, forcing them to work in an environment devoid of humanity. In Brothers Home, Jong Yun-ung and Choi Sung-woo were subjected to torture and beatings after being abducted from the streets by the police. They were forced to confess to crimes they had not committed and endured severe psychological trauma due to the brutal treatment they received. In Squid Game, we see the same situation where participants are forced to make life or death decisions in order to survive the deadly games, creating an atmosphere of terror and suffering, much like what happened in reality at Brothers Home. The children at Brothers Home were among the most severely affected victims, as they were forcibly abducted from the streets or their homes without any clear reason. They were placed in harsh conditions unfit for children, where they were forced to work in construction sites, farms, and factories under deteriorating health conditions. They had no rights or protection, and their lives were a series of physical and psychological violations. In addition to forced labor, they were subjected to constant violence and abuse, which included regular beatings and torture. In many cases, this treatment took on painful psychological forms, as their spirits were gradually broken, leading to a loss of sensitivity toward pain and violence. There were no serious attempts to provide any form of psychological care or even a healthy or safe environment for them. The children at Brothers Home lived in constant fear of punishment, many of them suffering from psychological trauma that persisted even years after their release. In Brothers Home, the games practiced in the camp were harsh and humiliating punishments imposed on the prisoners with the aim of either demonstrating their strength or breaking their will. The prisoners were forced to participate in violent games such as the motor vehicle game, where they were struck on their eyes until they swelled, or the Hiroshima game, which involved hanging the prisoners upside down for extended periods. These activities were used as a means of terrifying and forcing the prisoners into submission, in addition to being a repressive tool to reduce their resistance and exhaust them both psychologically and physically. These games bear a noticeable similarity to the games presented in Squid Game. In the series, contestants who suffer from heavy debts and difficult economic conditions are forced to participate in terrifying challenges, where the deadly activities vary, such as the tug-of-war and the glass bridge games. These resemble, in essence, the brutal games that were used in Brothers Home. Through this comparison, we see how the games in Brothers Home and Squid Game represent the same kind of brutal exploitation, where participants are forced to fight desperate battles for survival under inhumane conditions. During the rule of Chun Doo-hwan, who took power in South Korea through a military coup in the late 1970s, a policy of cleaning the streets of the homeless and political dissidents was implemented under the guise of improving South Korea's image before the world, especially in preparation for hosting the 1988 Olympic Games. These centers, like Brothers Home, were supposed to be places for the rehabilitation of the homeless. However, in reality, they became centers for forced detention. These individuals, including children and the elderly, were forcibly taken from the streets and public places through oppressive methods. In Brothers Home, the prisoners were forced to wear a uniform and lived in overcrowded rooms, much like the participants in Squid Game, where they were also required to wear a uniform and sleep in cramped spaces. In Brothers Home, prisoners were violently punished if they failed to perform the tasks assigned to them, and they were forced to work under poor health conditions. Similarly, in Squid Game, contestants are brutally punished if they fail to win or complete tasks successfully. Although Brothers Home was closed in 1987 after more than 30 inmates exposed the violations taking place inside, most of the officials involved were never held accountable. After many years of suffering, survivors like Han Jong-sun and Choi Sung-woo began demanding justice. Han organized protests starting in 2012 in front of the National Assembly in South Korea, calling for an official investigation into what had occurred. In 2016, the prosecutor who led the initial investigation into Hyunji Bakjun admitted that there was government pressure to halt the investigation into those atrocities. This acknowledgement from the authorities further strengthened the calls for accountability for those responsible for the violations. The tragic stories that occurred in reality are not just fictional tales, they are warnings from the past. If there is one thing we can learn from these stories, it is the necessity of protecting the most vulnerable in society and ensuring justice for those who have been subjected to injustice. Squid Game may be fictional, but the tragedy of Brothers Home remains a painful reality that calls on us to be more aware of human rights and how to preserve human dignity. Finally, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe and like for more upcoming videos on our channel, Infoblur. See you soon!